Part 2. So, to continue, MTG. Here's how to balance and eliminate power creep. Here's the whole thing. To use use/adapt my point system for attack and defense, and define your own point systems for each of your abilities, whether primary, secondary, special, etc. So, all of the abilities that you have in a set that you want to include in a set, assign them those designations. Separate them out into their card types and the various rules for what can be given to that card type, and just write up the abilities in their full, how to build in point buy form. When attack/defense, power toughness. When power toughness is given as an ability, for example, a bonus given by an equipment card, like I said earlier, token generation, counters, etc., use the calculated deck/play cost formula for attack defense as given to an ally in Mage War, so creature, monster, in other card games. Although it's Magic the Gathering, so I should say creature. I think primary abilities are pretty self-explanatory. You just have to define the costs for these abilities/effects, and I'll go over how to go about this below, where I talk about card rarity. Secondary abilities are non-conditional. Special abilities are conditional, which is why they don't incur play cost. We talked about this earlier. Let's take MTG's trample keyword as our first example, which has been adapted in many other games, including Mage War. This is a conditional mechanic, which in Mage War terms makes it a special ability. It is conditional because in order to make use of it, a creature must have been in combat with another creature, and only if that creature's toughness was less than its power. This means that trample does not incur play cost onto the card it is given to. Note, for Yu-Gi-Oh! This point is irrelevant because, with a few exceptions, monsters universally have attack/defense positions, which gives all of them piercing damage capability. In Magic, this rule of conditional versus non-conditional is much stricter because, as far as I can tell, almost all abilities in Magic, if I said Mage War I meant Magic, abilities in Magic which have a cost make that ability conditional. Let me read that again. All abilities in Magic which have a cost make that ability conditional. In Mage War terms, the Hallowed ability is secondary, even though, I should have said almost all abilities. That would have been weird. As far as I can tell, almost all abilities in Magic which have a cost make that ability conditional. In Mage War, the Hallowed ability is secondary, even though it costs a resource to activate, because this is simply fair for the power level of this ability in Mage War. Comparable abilities to conditional ally abilities would be the World abilities, which is equivalent in Magic to creatures with abilities that have an activation cost. So that would be, I guess the newer version that would be associated with Hallowed might be like indestructible until end of turn, something like that. Such abilities in Magic are much less powerful, and so are definitively more conditional, i.e. a player must spend a valuable resource to activate that ability, and often the cost is at least 2, commonly 1 colorless and 1 colored mana, so the ability is conditional because of that activation cost. This is just for creatures. Not for spells. Although perhaps for Magic, the distinction could still remain that activated abilities are conditional in the case of creatures and not spells, because creatures are easier to eliminate. Actually, it's pretty standard, universal. This may also be a near universal phenomenon of all TCGs that include these basic card types and interactions, i.e. creature versus spell, but I mean even more. I don't think there's really any justification for making something conditional when given to a spell, even if it's an activation cost. I think that's just how the ability is built. And then it's the cost for that activation of that ability. You might get into some kind of weird, murky territory with determining what is. I mean, it's obvious what would be strictly better and strictly worse. But if you're designing Mage War, not Mage War, Magic, if you're Wizards of the Coast's design team for Magic the Gathering, then you could play around with how much it costs to activate that ability, but you would always make it balanced, and you'd really have to, this is figuring out the power specifically of the ability, but how much that costs in terms of casting costs, what the play cost addition is of that, and its deck cost. But this is more just kind of like, the things that you already do, Wizards of the Coast, making sure that abilities are balanced in how they work. And, yeah, there's sometimes you don't catch things and here and there, but when you're designing it, it's pretty obvious that, whether something costs too much or too little in terms of activation. And playtesting reveals a lot of this, if it's not immediately obvious. But what's really helpful is that, again, and we'll go through more of this here as we keep reading, but there's a lot of examples that already exist that you can compare them to. And these have stood the test of many years of play. And I'm pretty sure there are almost no abilities that are, or there are very few in terms of cards, not abilities, cards, that get strictly better to the point that they're too good. Once you get that track of strictly better, it tends to stop at like the right point. I don't think they got to Lightning Bolt and said, hey, we should have a Lightning Bolt that costs 0. Then again, Magic does a lot of weird things, so maybe they've thought of that. But of course, that would be a terrible thing to do. That would be broken. And I guess we should keep reading here. Creature root, okay. Another tricky example is the two keywords Shadow and First Strike. While both abilities themselves might be considered non-conditional and therefore secondary, in MTG, when these abilities are combined, it is possible for them to have a negative net value. Specifically, a creature who has both Shadow and First Strike will only ever get to make use of that First Strike when in combat with other Shadow creatures, making First Strike conditional, in this case. This is good if you're fighting against Shadow creatures, but that may not always, in fact probably rarely is the case. Due to this, a card in a set which has two such abilities might have its play/casting cost altered to reflect that First Strike is conditional for that card. So that would mean that when you were writing up the design manual for that set, if you were having both First Strike and Shadow as abilities that could be given to cards, then under First Strike it would say becomes special or does not incur casting cost when given to a card or creature with Shadow. So if a creature already has Shadow, then First Strike becomes conditional. So that's kind of some of the other things that you'd have to think about in design. The next thing I'll go over is card rarity. This also encompasses the basic solution for power creep in all trading card games. I'll go over more about balance in a bit here. I may have to do that in a separate video as well, because it's a very complicated topic, and it's not really a standard, here's what to do. It's just, here's the formula, and never mind, I'll just keep reading here, because some of this gets explained, I think. define a standard total MP for your sets. I already went over that earlier. Just define a standard total MP for your sets. All sets going forward, define what a standard total available point total is for every set. Standardize that for all sets going forward. That's the basic balance. That's balance right there. But you would need to, also it's mechanical questions. So that way you can create whatever you want, but keep it within a certain known limit and standardize that limit so no sets overpower any others. Of course, and here's that note, the true power level of any set will be determined by how well it's constructed, but this definitely helps and definitely prevents power creep. Although also, specifically how it's constructed with, what new abilities are added to the game, new mechanics, and making sure that what you add isn't an instance of power creep. And I may have to mention something very specific here at the end, but yeah, doing this really helps, making sure every set has the same point total. So basically, use/adapt my formula for Mage War cube format to make your sets, but assume singleton since your sets don't include duplicates, and then define a total available set MP instead of Mage War's cube card minimum. Instead of Mage War's cube minimum card limit. Sorry for the tongue twister. To define a set. All of the 90 MP you have available to make standard Mage War decks, although obviously much more because it's a set and not a deck. I leave it to you, Wizards of the Coast, to work out and define whatever standard point total for sets seems best to you. Pause for note here. If you balanced it at a certain level, like I think the current power level is just maybe one or two. Well, some cards are insanely overpowered, but I think the standard power level for standard format is about maybe one step above balanced. And I think some modern cards fluctuate here. Some are obviously much more powerful, probably, although I don't know if they exceed the current power level of overpowered cards. But, obviously a lot of modern cards are weaker. But I think, yeah, if you balanced Magic the Gathering at about maybe a little below its current power level, moving forward, I think that would be a good target to hit when determining what point total each or all sets have moving. What point total sets have moving forward from now on. If you implement this solution, your rarity point totals, all the Mage War cubes. And of course, the costs for all of your abilities will be mostly, if not entirely, different from Mage War. But the system is easily adaptable, and the best method is to look back at previous iterations of abilities you've created to pinpoint the most balanced cost for that ability. A fantastic discussion that centers around doing this for a single card in Magic the Gathering is the YouTube video by the channel Ristic Studies titled Thragtusk the Polarizer. In this video, Ristic Studies provides several alternative cost designs for this card. And this is the process a design team might go through when designing new abilities, and with this system to define it for that set's new card design manual. What I mean specifically is that, for example, the two abilities given to Thragtusk in this system are defined in terms of how they affect play cost. And in this case, those abilities could be defined as having specific colored mana costs, which would make Thragtusk a multicolored creature. This is just an example, though. One of the examples provided by Ristic Studies. Oh, I should have capitalized that. That's another typo. Not a specific suggestion for Thragtusk. Yeah, so not a specific suggestion, but I thought that was a really good solution. I thought making it multicolored Although it would be tempting as a philosophy to assume that if a card is multicolored, that means it's weaker and that should reduce its casting cost, but ignore that inclination. That is wrong. It should be designed exactly the same, and it's not imbalanced. It's not imbalanced for a card, or it does not make it weaker to require multiple colored mana, because the player is determining what's in their deck. They're the one choosing their mana base, and that needs to be balanced with their curve. That needs to be something that is determined in deck construction, not in card construction at Wizards of the Coast. So that's not a negative. Making a multicolored creature is not a negative. It doesn't reduce its casting cost at all. It would just be that if a card had different abilities that specifically in their cost, like in Mage War, it tells you its cost, but in Magic you would say, oh, this cost is 1 blue, or 1 uncolored and 1 blue, and that would add to its casting cost. Specific to Magic the Gathering, as if it wasn't specific enough. One other thing I discovered while doing these, this section, oh man, you're right, I'm pausing here, because this is a whole separate video. We are not going into this right now, but I'm going to read this. One other thing I discovered while doing, oh man, I may have to do this. One other thing I discovered while doing these calculations was that a current card type in Magic the Gathering is, with a few exceptions, obsolete. This is a very sensitive topic, however, so I am not going into this further here. However, I will be discussing this specific topic in full where it is more convenient, as opposed to making this letter any longer than it needs to be, in a future YouTube video, which I will release as part of a series expanding on the topics of this letter as a whole. That's surreal. I, of course, will also be posting on that YouTube channel how to play videos, strategy guides, deck profiles, and other content as well. Shameless plug. Look for Mage War on YouTube soon. I guess we're here. Is that going to be a separate video? Yeah, I think it needs to be a separate video. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's going to be its own video. I can't even. I won't say anything more here about that. Nope. Pokemon, TCG, Yu-Gi-Oh, Exodus. You know, actually, this video is going to be specifically for Magic, because I'm not going to read the rest of these here. But I mean, Pokemon, you're pretty easy. Just, read this. Stop power creeping HP. You got this. Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm sorry, yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! It's going to take a little bit more. You're going to have to wait for, future editions for me to really show you a better deconstruction. The exchange abilities, while sort of proto-Yu-Gi-Oh! Aren't really what I describe here in this section, which is really what you'd have to do, and what I hope to do later. Exodus, yeah, I've never played Exodus, but if you guys are still doing it looks like you did. I checked recently. Great stuff, by the way. But yeah, man, listen to Rudy. Listen to Rudy. Finally, both I and the world will thank you if you applied these solutions. Thanks for reading. Although I guess I'm reading this to you, so thanks, Mark. Mark. So yeah, I'm going to be doing videos specifically analyzing cards. I don't know if I'll be able to get examples. I do have a couple Throne of Eldraine cards, just that I bought for fun. But yeah, I'm definitely going to be going over specific cards and showing what it would look like to determine the power level of a card. I kind of already gave you an example of how to break down a card, like the equipment card there. But something like Land of War Elves because in Mage War you see all cards tap for MP, so it's sort of like all allies start off as Land of War elves if they're all 1/1s. But would that affect the cost in Magic the Gathering? Well, we'll go over that. And we'll go over as many, main staple abilities as I can. But yeah, that's kind of the basic breakdown. Is when you're looking at spells, there is no, as far as I can tell, there's no conditional, non-conditional. It's all in the casting cost. So if you see that a spell's casting cost is much less than what that ability would cost on its own as a spell, then you're looking at an imbalanced card there. And you have to figure out how much all of those abilities would add up to with a proper casting cost. And they're all non-conditional because it's a spell. We're not talking about creatures anymore. So everything on there should add to its casting cost. Figure out what that is. Looking back at Alpha Beta provides a lot of the base examples. Some of them moving forward, some of the newer ones find their origins in things like Tempest and the Urza block, things like that. And then of course the newer abilities are kind of also easy to determine once you understand what the first version of that ability is. You can see how they changed it up, how they made it better, how they made it worse, whether they phased out other abilities, which could mean that they're both the same. It's just one is strictly better than the other, so that's why you don't see the other one moving forward in Magic. They would still have the same cost. You would still, if they were in the same manual, they'd be the same. It's just, if you were building a deck, you would obviously choose the better ability first before the other one. They were sort of, they would be tiered. But, okay. Final note here. Something about power creep, and this is something that kind of goes off the script. This is much more my opinion, but really I think there's a lot of people that have commented on things like this, so I don't think I'm too off the mark if I'm at all. Is that, well, you know what power creep is. It's an instance of necessity. If it's necessary, if not playing with it puts you at a disadvantage, a necessary disadvantage, if the only way to answer something is to include it in your deck, if the only answer for a card is itself that card, that is something that is broken. That is an instance of power creep. A strictly better mechanic is an instance of power creep. Not all power creeps in that sense are bad. For instance, going from can't be targeted by spells or abilities to hexproof. Yes, that is an instance of power creep. However, that was good. That made Magic better. That was a fixing of that ability to make it more playable. That made the ability what it should be. It gave all of the advantages. It fixed the deficiency. Because until then, you really weren't getting too much bang for your buck. You were hindering yourself. You were sort of, it was like a zero cost ability. It had a drawback, even though it kind of gave you something. And there were a lot of those that got fixed to actually make them have a strict directional benefit. And so that's kind of how to look at that. But then some of the newer instances of power creep. The first thing I'll go over here in real short is that, holy crap, for the first time ever, Magic the Gathering has 2-for-1s. Throne of Eldraine Adventures. Yeah, you know what those are? Those are 2-for-1s. We, for the first time ever, have 2-for-1s. Nobody has commented on this. Nobody has said this. I have watched so many people talk about Throne of Eldraine. Nobody has realized we have 2-for-1s. And everybody's like, Mark, What do you mean? We've had flip cards forever. Well, yeah, but flip cards aren't 2-for-1s. Those are strict choices. You have to choose. Transform cards are the same, in a different way. Transform cards are one card until they are the other. It's like an ability. It's like planeswalkers or cards with levels. Those are all great. Those are all perfect. The level cards, not an instance of power creep. Those are great. It tells you it's a specific ability that makes the card better, and so long as the cost for that benefit is balanced, then the mechanic itself, the leveling ability, is great. Transforming cards, although I'm not a big fan of double-sided cards, great. But adventure cards, you get 2 cards for 1 in your deck. Every card that you have with the adventure mechanic is an additional card in your deck without making it any bigger. There are some limits, obviously. You can't play the creature first and then activate the spell, but the spells themselves are not overcosted. They're all either basic or undercosted. Flaxen Intruder being the standout example, where it's obviously a little too high, it's an uncommon, but pretty much all the other adventure cards are insane. They're just the basic spell slapped onto a creature, and you can activate both. You can activate the spell, and then you can play the creature, and you don't even have to do it at the same time. You can do it later. It's like having an additional card in your hand that can't be targeted because you've removed it from play. We'll go over this more later, but that was the basic introduction. We have 2-for-1s. This is a very, very definitive power creep moment in Magic the Gathering. The moment where adventure cards were introduced. And the funny thing is, Wizards of the Coast has now dug themselves into a hole because everybody loves adventure mechanics. We expect them to be printed in future sets. And also, they kind of shot themselves in the foot here because the first set they introduced them in, Throne of Eldraine, makes those costs just what they would be on a spell. They're not overcosted. It's not, they don't add to the casting cost of the adventure spell because it's an adventure. It's just like having the spell itself on a separate card, but on a creature card. And you can activate both. Something else too, I'm going to go over in a future video as far as design philosophies. Kind of half objectivity, I'll say to say safe, part opinion, but I'm going to comment pretty heavily on what I think is bad design philosophy. There's a lot of cards that still get put in to Magic. We just found it with Throne of Eldraine. Sorry. With cards that stop you from playing the game, cards that stop your opponent from playing the game. Those abilities fundamentally should not be in Magic the Gathering because they make the game less fun. That's what they do. That's what they say on the card. It says when this gets activated, the game is less fun because you can't play it. Anything that stops your opponent from being able to play the game, that hinders you, that hamstrings you. This just, we keep seeing these. And there have been other videos, other people have pointed this out. There was a really great video, I think, from TCG Player going over the Mercadian Masks block. And there are a ton of examples of this all throughout Magic the Gathering. And again, even up to the current set. Was it Harmonious Archon or Hush? No, it's Hushbringer. Hushbringer. Hushbringer is, don't ever include those in Magic. And it's not because it's a power creep issue. It's not because it's imbalanced. It's because you're putting a card in your game that says, when this is in play, the game is less fun. You can play the game less. When this card comes into play, less of the game is played. And I don't know why this is counterintuitive for the Wizards design team, but if they've ever played Magic, if they've ever talked to a player, nobody likes playing against these, and the people that play them, unless they're doing it for competitive reasons because it's the meta, they have to. They're competing for their livelihood for money. Then yeah, if you're just playing with this casually, it's just people trying to piss off other players. People that just want a gimmicky deck that, you know, and it's not like, you know, I don't have a problem with control decks. I love control decks, but this is beyond that. This is, no matter what deck this is in, it makes the game less fun when it happens. And it creates those kind of decks that are just first turn win, your opponent doesn't get to do anything. You just stop them from playing, and there you go. Terrible design. My opinion, but I hope you Wizards of the Coast will see that years of Magic play has shown this time and time again. And the fact that you keep bringing it back, I don't get why. That's about as harsh as I'm going to get here. I'm trying to make this nice here because I understand there's a lot going on. But that was just my thoughts on that, and probably going to go over that more later, in addition to power creep. But that was the open letter. That was the basics and kind of a little more in-depth discussion. And thanks for watching. I know this is a long series. See you in the next video.